I have the honor of introducing our guest speaker, Dr. Schmidtke. He received his master's in developmental linguistics from the University of Edinburgh in 2011 and his PhD in cognitive science of language from McMaster University in 2016. He is now a research associate at the Center of Advanced Research in Experimental and Applied Linguistics at McMaster University. He currently researches the language development of English language learners who are enrolled in an academic bridging program. Today, he will also discuss his recent study using eye tracking to assess improvement in reading efficiency and comprehension of students in academic bridging programs. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Schmidtke.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Like I said, it's a real pleasure to be able to talk to you all today. As far as being interactive, if you have a question and you want to interrupt midway through, please do. I encourage that. If I didn't make sense, just please, feel free to just jump in and ask a question. I'll be minimizing my chat, so I won't be able to see text questions on the fly, but if you just jump in vocally, that would really help. Okay, so today I'm going to talk to you about a project that I've been working on here at McMaster in collaboration with, as part of an English language development program called MELD. So I will refer to this program as MELD. You can see it at the bottom right, the bottom center here. This is the program, the development program that I collect data from. I work as well within the Center for Advanced Research in Experimental and Applied Linguistics at McMaster, which is an adjoining center where we do research, psycholinguistic research, etc. And this work that I'll be presenting today is done in collaboration with Sadaf Rahmanian and Anna Morrow, who is the director of the MELD program. So, like I said, I'm doing research with MELD students. And before I dive into hypotheses and the nitty-gritty details of the study, I just want to give you a brief overview of international student growth in Canada, and also leading on to talking about the composition of bridging programs or EAP programs in Canada. So there's this great website called the Canadian Bureau for International Education, which has loads of really great statistics. I think that statistics are drawn from and distilled from the Statistics Canada website. And this website has loads of really cool stuff. Like, it tells us that between 2010 and 2020, there was a 135% increase in international student population in Canada, which is huge. That means that by the end of 2021, there were approximately 620,000 international students studying in Canada at all levels of study. That's 20% of all of the university students in Canada. What is more is that 60% of these students, according to a sample of students polled, go on to apply for permanent residency in Canada. This is based on a statistic which says that 96% of the international students recommend Canada as a place of study. So we can surmise from these basic statistics that international students are a growing body in the Canadian student population. They account for a large proportion of the student population, and they then intend to stay and join the skilled labour force in Canada. Where do these international students come from? Well, you can see with this, again, I've taken this from the CBIE website. They have this nice little infographic which shows that there are two countries where a majority of the international students come from. The first is India, and the second is China. What we see in Canada is that most of the international students that come from India, in fact, practically all of them, do not go into an EAP program. They do not need a top-up English program. 99.9% of the students enrolled in MELD come from China, which is the second most populous origin. Where do they study? Well, it's no surprise that many of the international students go to Ontario, which is also where most of the immigrant population reside or end up going in Canada. That's almost half of them go to Ontario. So lots of international students come over. What happens if they don't, if they are unable to do a university degree? What are the reasons for that? Well, they go onto an English language bridging program, and these pathways are for international students who use English as an additional language, but they do not meet the English proficiency threshold of the host institution. So they're super talented, they can do all the academic stuff, but they just don't have that requisite to study at a university level with the English skill that they have. There are many bridging programs in Canada, and there was this recent fantastic paper that I stumbled across upon a couple of weeks ago by Roy and Landry, and they did the drudgery, the task of just documenting how many bridging programs exist. And surprising that there's not that much data out there like this at a national level. So they found that in Canada alone, there are 74 bridging programs existing, and these are across around 50 different institutions. So the same host institution can have multiple different programs. 12 out of 15 of Canada's, what's the U15, 12 of them host an English bridging program. The U15 are Canada's 15 biggest, most research-intensive universities. This study showed that the minimum study duration that you're expected to do if you're an EAP program student is 13 weeks. But there's a huge range there. It ranges from 6 to 36 weeks. So there's this huge variability in how much time you can spend on a bridging program. There's also a huge variability in how much contact time in the language of instruction you get a week. So the median time is 21.5 hours a week of contact hours in English with an instructor. But again, that ranges from 6 to 36 hours. That range between 6 and 36 is just purely coincidental. What about cost? Roy and Landry came up with this neat little metric. Because we have such a range in duration for a bridging program, instead of, with longer programs tend to cost more, shorter programs cost a little bit less, they did a cost per week of study, and the median is 444 Canadian dollars per week of study, which is quite expensive. So from this data, we can surmise that the bridging programs, if you want to sit on one, you're joining a very popular trend. They can be time consuming. You'd have to sit maybe up to a full academic year on one. There's high stakes involved. So because of the cost, the huge cost and the time investment, you want to be able to pass it. You want to be able to get to a point where you are able to enter the undergraduate population as a proficient English speaker. A little bit about the English proficiency profile of students, EAP students. Based on, again, this study, the median IELTS score required for entry into a bridging program was 5.5. But that ranges again from 3 to 6.5. So there's a minimum bar there for entering into a bridging program. Some really lower the bar because of profit trends. They want to attract as many students as possible. Some keep a very high and rigorous bar. But the median is around 5.5. What does that mean? Well, according to the IELTS band descriptors, which can be quite opaque at times, they say that 5 is a modest language user, 6 is competent, 7 good, 9 is an expert language user. So entering into a bridging program, you want to, they're attracting modest, competent users, but also perhaps lower than that. But most bridging programs don't attract or don't allow in good users. These will be users that are already at the threshold to join the university population, direct entry. A little bit about the MELD program at McMaster, and that's the focus of the study. It's an 8-month program of English language instruction, so it's on the longer end of that that range there from Roy and Landry's study. We were actually right at the median of that study, so 21 weekly contact hours. This is an aspect that is not covered by that study, but I think is important, and that is that the program is not leveled. The students are randomly assigned to classes. They're not grouped based on their incoming IELTS language skill. That will become important later on when I talk about the reading results. The admission thresholds. To get into the undergraduate study, you have to have at least a 6.5 with a minimum of 6 in the 4 IELTS subtests, the reading, writing, speaking, and listening. And we require a minimum overall IELTS score of 5 to join the MELD program. So that's a bit of a background about the Canadian context for bridging programs, zooming in a little bit on MELD, give you a little bit of a profile there. Now I'm going to be a little bit self-centered for one slide and just talk about myself. So I was trained as a psycholinguist. That should say psycholinguist, not psycholinguistic. And my interest has always been in language development. I've got a real interest in change across within individuals and language change across time too. But my real focus is on individual differences in reading. I'm super interested in looking at how reading develops and grows within an individual. And I work within MELD as a researcher, and I use a bunch of different methods here at MELD. My main method, though, is in eye movements in reading. I also do generally corpus and quantitative linguistics too. Where I sort of joined MELD, when I joined MELD, I got a question from my director, boss, Anna Morrow, who says, well, here's a question. Are the students getting better at reading throughout the bridging program? Do they get better from the beginning to the end? This would be a good test of the efficacy of the bridging program. There are many different tests of an efficacy for bridging program, but one of them can be, do the students overall get better? What are the extent of the gains that can be made in a bridging program of our length of 8 months? It's super important to ask such questions because it's an under-researched population, the students that sit in EAP program. Why is it under-researched? Well, these programs are largely run, not all the time, but largely run by external companies. There's not much quality assurance and efficacy data. These are big, huge companies, make millions of dollars, and they don't really release much of their data. For those programs that do have in-house research, how many published papers examine the improvement of language abilities directly? The answer is 5. There was a recent study, I quoted something a little bit different in the paper for that I gave you for the class, that was something like 10, but specifically looking at growth between time 1 and time 2, like beginning and end of a program, only 5 studies. In this study, as you may have gathered, I'm going to be looking at reading and why are we really interested, or why am I really interested in studying the reading development of bridging program students? Well, there's this fantastic paper that I keep referencing time and time again from Trenkich and Warmington. It came out in 2019 in Bilingualism, Language and Cognition. And they looked at how much variance in undergraduate GPAs can be explained in literacy skills. And they looked across two groups. The first group, they looked at international students. In another group, they looked at just domestic students, regular L1 English domestic students. They tested them on a whole bunch of English language skill tests. Then they used the performance in those skill tests as a predictor for their later GPAs as they were in an undergraduate study. And what was hugely striking is that international students, 51% of the variance, like over half of the variance, was explained by their literacy skills and their GPAs. That's huge. And what is crazy about that is that if you compare that with regular domestic students, the difference is stark. Only 10% of the variance was explained by language skill by domestic students. So Trenkich and Warmington surmised that, well, reading is really important for second language users of English as a second language. In an ideal world, I suppose, you'd want those numbers to be on a balance. You want them to be similar, right? Whatever the size of that variance explained, you'd want them to be of a similar size. Domestic students got higher GPAs too. Not only was the variance explained larger by the reading skills, the GPAs were better too compared to international students. So reading skills play a role. In this next slide here, I've provided a little breakdown of the top skills that they looked at in order of variance of percentage of unique variance explained. So vocabulary comes top, followed by reading comprehension, followed by speed of text processing, and then followed by spelling. So component skills of reading-related skills really matter for international students. So I think it's really important to really look at this. In the international students that Trenkich and Warmington looked at, they did do in a couple of little parts in their paper, they did look at the difference between international students who sat an EAP program versus those who did not, but they didn't compare the amount of variance explained with these different language tests. It's not hard to believe why reading can be important for a university student, especially one who uses English as a second language. Reading is hugely important for acquiring new knowledge in the language of instruction. Think about a timed exam. You've got lots of pressure, time pressure to really go through a lot of information, read a lot of text. Also, reading from lecture slides or reading on Zoom slides like this, you've got to get a lot of information, a lot of textual information quickly. And sometimes professors go quite fast through their slides. Also, just reading is generally important for studying under time constraints, not in timed exams, just for homework and so on. You've only got a certain amount of time before you can read this paper or book or chapter in a book. So being able to efficiently read and read with a high degree of comprehension is really important. Some initial research that we've done here in the MELD program spoke to that overarching question that Anna Morrow posed to me, which is, what is the extent of the reading gains that bridging program students can make during a bridging program? So in this study, we had a sample of 70 students. The abstract is here. They're all Chinese, Mandarin or Cantonese Chinese speaking students. They're all enrolled in the MELD program. And this is a table 7 from that paper. And this table provides for each measure a breakdown of the extent of the gains from time 1 to time 2 for the relevant test. Now, I highlighted 4 tests here. These 4 skills are implicated heavily in reading, and what you see here is that the highlighted cones D, the effect size, the larger the cones D, the bigger the effect size. The effect sizes range from small to medium all the way to large for reading comprehension. So this gives you an estimate of the type of gains that can be made in a bridging program just purely based on a few composite skill tests of English language. So we've got phonological awareness, which we found in that paper was strongly implicated in the ability to decode during lexical processing. We looked at phonological memory as well, which had a large effect size. Vocabulary knowledge, interestingly, had the smallest effect size out of those skills that I've highlighted, but reading comprehension had quite a huge effect size. So that gives you an idea of kind of what we can glean from this time 1, time 2 information. And this was a starting point for our research. And today I'm going to dive into the paper that was recently accepted in Bilingualism, Language and Cognition. And in this paper, we looked at a larger sample of students, and we asked about what's going on with differences in growth across time. Are there individual differences on growth across time? And is that based on incoming reading ability of a bridging program student? So I'll provide a motivation for this study as we go on. Just going back to Trenkich and Warmington, if reading skill matters for the academic outcomes of the general population of students who speak English as an additional language, EALs, then it must be at least important, logically, it must be at least important for those EALs that enter through a bridging program. The kind of question, does reading skill improve during a bridging program, is a huge, important basic test of EAP program efficacy, right? That's the whole impetus behind this little research project. We want to go one step further with this project and ask, are reading gains influenced by what's going on with a reading skill at the outset of the bridging program, right at the beginning of the program? That is, do students improve at different rates, and does that depend on the incoming reading ability of the student? This is an important thing to consider. If we find that there are differences in trajectories, or there are initial differences based on initial reading skill, however we may measure that, then we might want to be tailoring some pedagogical resources to the students in the program who need it most. So taking these 2 sets of research motivations and we convert them into research questions, which was, again, does reading skill improve during a bridging program? Basic question. 2, are there individual differences in the developmental paths, the growth paths of reading skill across time? And in coming up with possible hypotheses space here for the possible growth trajectories of students, we came up with 3 possibilities, 3 broad possibilities, let's say. The first is that we might observe divergence among bridging program students. So here I have a plot where on the x-axis I have program start, program end, so that's basically a time axis. On the y-axis, I have some generic reading skill measure. A lower score closer to the bottom, close to the x-axis, would be worse, and somewhere up above there would be better performance. I have 2 lines. The green line represents a reader who has a low baseline L2 reading skill, so comes into the bridging program with a lower reading ability. The orange line represents a student who has a high baseline L2 reading ability. So what you see here is that we predict that those who are better incoming perform better on the reading skills that we test them on at the beginning of the program. It's kind of like a very basic, straightforward assumption. But what we're interested in is the trajectory of the lines across time. What we see here is that the lines widen, they diverge over time. The high baseline L2 reader gets better much faster than the low L2 reader. So that's a possible pattern. That's known in the L1 reading acquisition literature as the Matthew effect. The rich get richer. The second possibility is convergence. This is the scenario when the two types of readers close the gap. This would be a case where the MELD program serves to drive the reading skill, improve the reading skills specifically and most for the students who come in with poorer reading skill, poorer reading ability. We call this the convergence hypothesis. Finally, the third is stability. That is pure parallel lines right the way through the program. The gap stays the same. Right? There might not be a gap at the beginning of the program start. We hypothesize that there is a gap, but they run on parallel tracks. They do not converge with one another. So we tested these hypotheses. We wanted to test these hypotheses in this study. This was a study, a longitudinal study. It had 2 time points. So we measured students at the program start and then again at the program end. And this study had 405 participants across 3 different cohorts of MELD. So the green cohort is cohort 1. These were 2017-18. The largest cohort is cohort 2, which is 2018-2019. And then the smallest cohort is cohort 3. And the reason why it's the smallest cohort, this could have been a lot larger. This was, we couldn't get full longitudinal data because COVID had other plans. So we were unable to test all of the students. But this is a general overview of the cohorts. So I just want to talk to you a little bit about the logistics and challenges of doing such a study. We label this data as quality assurance data because we're testing the efficacy of the program. And that had implications for how we actually were able to run our study. So all students were who took part in the study received course credit. So there was a strong incentive for them to take part in the study. Virtually all of the students who sit the program at any given year actually took part in the study. And we had an ethics protocol, which was this little subclass of ethics, which is a little bit different to everything that I had been used to previously in my life as a psycholinguist. And this is a secondary use of data protocol, which basically says that, okay, you can collect any data if you can justify it. You can collect any data from a student. And you can use it. You ask for their consent afterwards, right at the end. So we did all of the testing, and then at the end, we asked, are we allowed to use your data? That was great because it allowed us to collect a large N, because all the students are strongly have a strong incentive to take part in the study. They get the course credit for the MELD program, and the testing was built into the program. We had a lot of data. The disadvantages were that it was a logistical nightmare. Just to give you a flavor of that, we had 3 eye trackers testing up to 400 students. Remember, at one time we did have 400 students, but not all of them consent, but testing 400 students within a 2-week window. So we were running it 6 days a week at 30 minutes of testing session. So that was there was a logistical nightmare, and I wouldn't recommend, if you want to do a postdoc, I wouldn't recommend doing a longitudinal study like that if you want to publish things quickly and fast. Okay, so moving on now to actually the assessing the English reading ability. So we had students read 6 passages of text that were relatively easy to medium difficulty, taken from the Grey Oral Reading Test 5, the 5th edition. So that is otherwise known as GORT. And we had participants read the passages while their eye movements were recorded. We recorded them with 2 different iLink 1000 pluses and 1 iLink 1000. After reading the passages of text, the comprehension was assessed using the Grey Oral Reading Test, the questions that you get with it, and GORT had alternate forms, so it had an A and a B, and so they were counterbalanced across time points. And what did we use? So we specifically interested in passage reading. We wanted to look at global trends in global passage reading. So what the overall picture for someone reading a passage of text. So obviously passage comprehension is one of them. And the eye movement measures that we looked at were as follows. We looked at 5 different ones. We looked at silent reading rate, measured in words per minute. We looked at number of skips. We looked at the number of fixations. We looked at the number of regressions, and then we looked at the total reading time. These were normalized per number of words per passage. So we took into account the length of the passage. We looked at the Cronbach's alpha for passage comprehension, which was adequate, and the intra-class correlation coefficients for words per minute we also looked at, which was high in the good range. So one of the challenges that I had when conceiving of this study and thinking about how to do this was, how do I measure the incoming reading score of the students? There are a couple of options here. The first option is to quantify the incoming reading ability based on the dependent measure itself. So there are a number of eye movement, longitudinal eye movement studies that will stratify the population of interest by their incoming score on that thing that they're looking at, the thing that they're interested in, say words per minute. And so they'll create 4 groups, and they'll split them into, say, quartiles, and then you will do a regression model, or you can do a quantile regression, a fancy regression, which will look at growth conditional on where you first, what your starting point was in the measure that you looked at. That has a disadvantage in that what you might be seeing is not differences in trajectories across time, but an artifact of regression to the mean. So you measure the same person at a different time point. What you see is, well, not growth, but some kind of closer convergence to the mean for that group. So to sort of sidestep that, we found a different way to do it. We quantified the baseline reading ability based on the IELTS reading score. Right? So we took all of the incoming IELTS reading subtest scores, and we used that to stratify and group our participants. And we used the actual numeric numbers themselves as the predictor variable here. I'll go over the model in a couple of slides, or maybe the next slide. Because there's another option here. We could have binned the students into 4 different groups, or 2 different groups, or 3 different groups. But why discretize a continuous measure? We just included the IELTS score as a predictor in our models. And here is the model. So we fitted the same linear mixed effects regression model to all the outcome measures. For the passage comprehension measures, we used generalized linear mixed effects models because the outcomes were binomial. ones and zeros. For both model types, we tested the time point slope differences as a function of baseline reading ability. That's our core hypothesis here. That's translating that idea about the different trajectories into a testable hypothesis. So a significant interaction between time point, it could be the time one, time two levels, a significant interaction between time point and baseline reading ability would show divergence or convergence. It would depend on what the qualitative pattern of the interaction would be. An insignificant time point by baseline reading ability effect would show stability, meaning that there's no interaction. Your trajectory across time is not conditional on your incoming baseline reading ability. We had a bunch of different control variables, and we included form as a control. We looked at the effect of different eye trackers as a control. We looked at the effect of cohort. Important, we didn't find anything of interest there. Passage complexity was an important control variable that we included here. And another super important thing that we looked at, we included random intercepts for passage ID, so the number of the passage complexity. And we also included bi-participant random intercepts with random slopes for time point. That sounds like a huge lot of fancy talk. And basically what that means is that little last part with the bi-participant random intercepts with slopes for time point means that each individual, each MELD student can have different growth trajectories, individual growth trajectories. And by including a random slope for time point with their bi-participant random intercept, we're controlling for that variability and change across time. That's all that does. It allows us also to look at some super cool things, like we can look at using just the correlations between the bi-participant intercepts and the slopes over time. If we look at those correlations by extracting those from the model, we can actually look at the whole convergence divergence hypothesis too, and it can give us an extra little bit of evidence. We'll look at that when I get to the results. So here are the results. I'm going to break this down bit by bit. Firstly, in our model, we saw time point differences, and I've just chosen silent reading rate, words per minute here, as an example, just to walk through an example measure. So on the x-axis, again, we have time point, time one, time two. On the y-axis, we have words per minute, ranging from 108 words per minute to 118 words per minute. And what we found, firstly, was that there was a significant main effect of time. Readers get faster on average. You have more words per minute at time two than at time one. We also found that baseline reading ability matters, which is hugely interesting in and of itself, right? If we find that IELTS corresponds to eye movements, that's a really interesting thing to show. And as expected, the better your incoming baseline reading ability, that's on the x-axis, the better or the faster you are as a reader. So stronger incoming readers are faster readers overall. This is both time points broken down. This is a main effect. What about that interaction? Well, if you've read the paper already, you will already know what the outcome is, but here it is. There were no differences in reading trajectories. There was no significant interaction between baseline reading ability and time point. And I've tried to visualize that here, where each line corresponds to a different level of baseline reading ability. So at the bottom, you've got 4.5. At the top, you've got 7. And you see that where there is a difference, because we just saw it in the main effect, there is a difference in baseline reading ability from the fast to the slowest. What we see here is that they follow a stable trajectory across time. Stability. So at least for silent reading rate, we confirm the hypothesis of stability. And this is what we found for the rest of our measures. We found that, again, reading comprehension in the top left, readers got better over time, but that, again, there was this stable pattern of growth. The better readers didn't catch up, didn't slow down and converge with the poorer readers, and they didn't diverge either. Silent reading rate, they get more efficient over time as readers, look at faster. And we also find that fixations reduce, which is a good thing. They tend to fixate less, which may be, and this is a global pattern of a global level of analysis, which may be an index of less trouble with decoding words. The more difficulty you have in converting those graphemes into phonemes and vice versa, the more you will fixate. So there are fewer fixations over time. Again, this was a stable pattern. We found greater skipping rates. So more advanced readers tend to skip function words more, shorter words more frequent words they'll skip over. And what we're finding here is we are able to break it down by function word or frequency here, but at a general broad level, they are skipping more, again, at a stable rate. And finally, total fixation duration. It's highly correlated with silent reading rate, but your fixation durations per word also decrease significantly, and again at a stable pattern. Now you might notice there's one eye movement measure that's missing here in this cell that we went over, and that is regressions. We didn't find any effect of time point on regressions, meaning that lookbacks, regressions indicate lookbacks to earlier parts of the text, didn't change. They stayed stagnant over time. Given that lookbacks are argued to reflect higher level semantic processing, it could be that while we see improvements in decoding and fixations and so on and low level skills, we're not finding too much of a change in the integration of meaning across within sentences and across sentences. That is kind of one way of looking at it, but it does go against the fact that we do find that comprehension gets better over time. So they are comprehending texts better, but their integration of texts, of words across text, tends not to change too much. This part isn't front and center in the paper, but I think it's hugely important to look at too. We can look at the correlations, the relationship between the initial starting point and the subsequent growths of each individual person. And we can get a measure of how much the initial starting point matters for their long-term growth. And this sounds like I'm going back on my argument that it's not cool to look at change conditioned on the dependent measure itself, but biparticipant random slopes are mean corrected, and they are a more stable measure, a better measure, I should say, of individual growth. They take into account some of the extremities in the data. And so on the x-axis, I have a correlation coefficient going from -1 to +1, and I have all the different reading rates here. If you have a stronger negative correlation, it would indicate that you see greater convergence in your eye movement measures. And if you have a stronger positive correlation, you have greater divergence in your eye movement measures across time. Correlation coefficients resting near the middle would indicate greater stability. So what did we find here? We found that, by and large, the correlation stayed right in the middle there, basically. you found that there was no relationship between initial starting point and subsequent growth. The strongest that we did find for that was with fixations. There was the strongest correlation out of everything, and it tended to show a greater convergence, but that correlation coefficient was not significant. So we see here a pattern of stability on two fronts, from the random slopes and from the fixed effects in the regression models. So going back to my research questions, research question 1 was, does reading skill improve during a bridging program? Well, here's the average change over time, the relative change. And we see that the largest changes were for passage comprehension, followed by reading rate in words per minute and total reading time and fixations. Regressions, we didn't really see much of a change in, which is interesting. Let's talk a little bit about those improvements then. We found that students reached a speed of between 103 and 130 words per minute. 103 for the students with the lowest income IELTS score and 130 for those with the highest incoming IELTS score. So by the end of the bridging program, they were within that range. That is roughly 50% of the estimated reading speed of an average L1 reader. This is based on this fantastic paper by Mark Brisbart in the Journal of Language and Memory and Language. He found that 238 words per minute was the average reading speed of an L1 English reader. So there is improvement, but they're still at 50% of the speed of the average reader. We see improvement in reading comprehension, which is a great thing. The reading comprehension indicates that, well, they're understanding more of written text. There are changes in core measures of eye movements during reading. So you have skipping, greater skipping, fewer fixations and shorter fixation times. These show that overall reading efficiency increases. They're getting faster, possibly at decoding. They're getting better at judging upcoming words in their paraphobia. And the fixations themselves are getting shorter, possibly because they're more they're more familiar with some of the words that they're seeing. We don't find change in regressive saccades. And like I said before, because regressive saccades are linked to higher level processing, it might be that there are still disruptions to those high level processing of texts. So these strategies remain static over time. What about research question 2? Are there individual differences in the developmental trajectories of reading skill? Well, we found a pattern of reading stability. That is, the gap between the weakest and the strongest readers remain the same. Just digging into that a little bit further, that means that if we take the numbers from the regression model, every one band increase in your incoming IELTS reading score came with an 11% boost in reading comprehension and reading speed entering into an undergraduate program. So there is a huge advantage for readers who come in to the bridging program with a high level of reading skill. I just want to link back to the beginning of the talk. I told you that bridging program students are very attractive. They're very popular and prevalent now in Canada, at least, and in many Western higher education institutions. I told you that there is, given the amount of the popularity of these bridging programs, there's a great lack of research. And I told you that the literature hints at reading skill being a particularly interesting and important skill to look at for the academic success of L2 users of English in university settings. So based on that, what do we know now about EL readers? What are the challenges for students based on the questions that I asked? And what kind of future questions can I ask of this population? So what do we know now? So I'm going to recapitulate some of those results again. ELs improve in their English reading ability during an 8-month bridging program. We know that IELTS reading scores are a reliable proxy of eye movement behavior during reading. And we also know that the bridging program doesn't seem to privilege either the weakest or the strongest readers, which might be the most optimal outcome, actually. If you were to develop a program, would you want to privilege one group versus another, or for the most beneficial outcome for all people? Is that something that you'd want to have instead? And this is really interesting, is remember that I told you that the MELD program is leveled. So we're finding these effects even though even in a mixed environment where students are not grouped based on IELTS. I'm wondering if there would be a difference if they were grouped based on IELTS, and whether that would be beneficial or not. So in summary, this is up for debate. I'd love to hear what you have to say about it, but stability might be the most optimal outcome for any educational program. There are still challenges facing bridging program students, though. This is, like I said, a high stakes scenario for second language learners. The pressure, it really is on for them. They're spending a lot of money. Their future undergraduate career depends on a bridging program performance. And we know that the bridging program students are already on the back foot relative to domestic students based on other data that we have, and possibly other international students too. Just to paint that picture with a little bit more detail, the reading speed gap between the average reader in the bridging program and an average L1 English reader by Brisbart's account is about 100 words per minute. That translates to a coverage of 6,000 fewer words over just a 1-hour period. Imagine that being a 1-hour study period or a 1-hour exam period. So there's still work to be done. Is it possible to bring about larger gains in reading skill? Can we somehow stimulate different reading strategies that can promote greater higher order reading comprehension, greater regressions? Can we target this specific skill and trying to improve it? Does this skill go hand in hand with reading comprehension? We need to dive into this a little bit more. Which component skills of reading might promote larger gains in passage reading? I tapped into this in a previous paper that I showed you before, but that was at the lexical level. That showed you what was going on at a really minute micro level. I'd like to know what's going on at the larger scale. Another question is, do English language bridging programs make a difference to academic success? And there's so little research on this, and some of the research that I'm doing now is looking at the contributions of eye movement behavior and reading skill development to the post-bridging program completion academic performance of the same students. So tracking the students into the undergraduate level. This would be another way of looking at the importance of reading skill for this population of students. So I'd just like to finish there, and thank you so much for listening. I'd like to thank my co-authors, Sadaf Rahmanian and Dr. Anna Morrow, and I'd like to really highlight the contributions of a small army of research assistants that we hired over the years in helping collect all of the data. And if you'd like to read the paper, if you haven't done so already, there's a link to the paper directly at my ResearchGate. So thanks so much, everyone, for listening.